know now that Elinor Ostrom, who just won the Nobel in economics, the jury, when they gave it to her, said that her theories on common property regimes are significant in light of the growing threat to climate change. They actually looked at what she's doing and the very thing you're talking about. What does that tell you, that this is out there on that level?
We work together in areas where we have to cooperate. That's the sort of thing that she's very good at, and I think that's central. And I think the reason the Nobel Prize was awarded to her was because people can see this shift coming from where it's no longer sufficient to look after employees and to make a profit. Business is moving on to something else.
So for the longest time, we have seen a disconnect when it comes to climate change. We see scientists like yourself talking about the urgency. We see politicians talking about it, but the wheels of government and bureaucracy winding very slowly, and we have seen businesses slow to catch on. Is that disconnect ending? Do you see a change?
I think so. It's interesting when you look at our systems of government. They've all been put in place to sort of prevent change, really, haven't they? The American Constitution has been put in place to stop the British coming back, or whatever, 200 years ago. And the Japanese Constitution, likewise to stop the Emperor coming back. So there's sort of a certain amount of inbuilt inertia in them. But the thing about it is, once you actually have some sort of global action, and once you start the paradigm shift where people will have to pay for their pollution, I'm confident things will move quickly. And just as one small example of that, last year in the United States, even before there was any legislation in place, 48% of all of the new energy infrastructure was low emissions energy, wind and so forth. So that tells you that people are positioning themselves for this new future. The game plan for the polluters is just to delay it as long as possible, because every year they delay it is another year of fat profit for themselves.
And yet, in your book, In Now or Never, you talk about your own despair at where we are and how urgent this has become, and how the will still isn't there, enough will isn't there.
Well, that's right, and I suppose despair is the right sort of word, but I get more grumpy these days than despairing. I must be getting older. But I don't think we can afford to be too despairing. We've got to just stick with it, and sometimes it does drive you crazy to see the way that lies can be told, and the way that the situation slips due to circumstance or whatever. But we just have to keep pushing, because these next few months are just so very important. They really are. I do believe that what happens at Copenhagen is going to be critically important to all of our futures, and we have to give it our best go.
And what has to happen at Copenhagen to make it a success?
Well, that is the great question. My personal belief is we have to have a basic sort of heads of agreement. We have to have those 190 odd leaders of countries coming together to agree the basics of the new treaty. And the basics of it there's only going to be a few elements in it, really. One is emission caps. There's going to be some sort of restrictions on the amount people are going to emit. The second is going to be about adaptation. It's going to be about getting enough funding to the poorest people on the planet to secure their future in the face of climate change. So, the African countries are asking for $69 billion a year for that purpose, and that will be the cost of bringing them in. And that's, I think, quite reasonable, because those poorest people have had no benefit from the Industrial Revolution that's produced the pollution in the first place. We're the ones who have the benefit. So we need to take that into account. And the third element of the treaty is going to be things like around forests, around better agricultural practices and so forth.
Let's talk about the money. The U.S. government spent, $700 billion at the time of the start of the economic downturn to bail out banks. A lot of countries are going to say our budgets are tight, we're now in deficit. Will the will to spend the money that's necessary be there?
Well, that's another great question. And Gordon Brown has been one of the world leaders who has been pushing very hard to make sure the money will be there, against European opposition and American opposition and so forth. But I think there's a chance the money will be there. It has to be. It's one of the absolute prerequisites for a successful treaty. But that $700 billion, that's only part of the story. We've spent trillions bailing out the richest and most powerful people on the planet, the bankers and the investment bankers, you know. And have we heard any complaint? No, in fact, when government says, well, we really should cap their salaries, banking's too important to be left to people who believe it's just good enough to make a profit and look after employees, we hear screams of indignation from the banking sector. I think
that's because we only interview the banks, we don't interview the other people.
Well, that's quite right. Yeah, indeed. But I think that's part of this big change that's happening, and you know, hopefully we won't have to do that sort of thing again.
But you mentioned Nicholas Stern. He said that a couple of years ago, that if we don't spend the money now, we will pay later.
That's right. Yeah, there's no easy way out of it, and this is going to cost money. It's going to, you know, and we will have to make investments in our future. That's just the nature of the problem we face. But as we say, the consequences of not doing that are much more severe. And the economists' argument about this, they're so crazy about this discounting the future. Have you heard this argument about discounting the future rate? They say, well, any money you invest in the problem now, you know, it's going to be wasted because in future we'll be so much richer and we can actually put more money in and deal with the problem in the future. And I think, well, there's something missing in this argument. You know, there's kind of where's the reality check that actually there is a physical system called the planet, you know, that can go beyond the tipping point, but they just don't seem to see that.
I want to ask you about something else. We've done a lot of work at the Current on carbon capture and carbon trading. But what you also see are countries like, there was an example we used last week in the Netherlands. They build a new coal-fired generating plant, and then they go and plant trees in Uganda. And we're seeing this a lot. Like, we continue to live the way we want to live with energy that is dirty. Yeah. And then we go, well, we'll just be taking a little bit of your land over here, thanks very much, and plant some trees. Like, is that sustainable?
No, because it actually avoids one of the great questions, or one of the great issues, which is that carbon isn't just carbon. Yeah, carbon in coal is carbon that has been safely captured and stored in the rocks of our planet for millions and millions of years. And it would remain that way if we hadn't dug it up. And you can't tell me that planting a tree in Uganda results in carbon as safely sequestered as that coal in the ground. Yeah? There are some technologies that will do that, however, and one of the most interesting is the charcoal-based technologies. And basically, the pyrolysis technologies, the charcoal technologies, the best way to think about them is reversing the process that takes place in a coal-fired power plant. You know, in a coal-fired power plant, you take the coal out of the ground and you put it into the chamber and combust it, and there the little carbon atoms join with bigger oxygen atoms to form carbon dioxide, and they go up through the smokestack and into the atmosphere. Well, with pyrolysis, you know, that process starts when a plant captures that carbon dioxide, strips out the oxygen, uses the carbon to build its tissue, its wood and so forth, and then you can take that wood and put it into a pyrolysis machine, which basically just heats it in the absence of oxygen, and that mineralises the carbon in that plant. And mineralised carbon doesn't rot, so you can take that carbon, that charcoal, put it into agricultural soils and store it for millennia. And the benefits to agriculture are quite enormous. The best study of how important this can be was done in Canada earlier this year, where people studied the impacts of char on cornfields and found that half a tonne an acre of char in Canadian cornfields enhances crop yields by up to 7%. Now, in tropical soils, which are much poorer and much more in need of organic matter like charcoal, the crop yields can be 200%. So there we've got a great mechanism. It's a win-win. You know, we deal with food security, we deal with the carbon crisis, and you know, we actually create a whole new business around that. But that's not going to happen until we have a price on carbon, because the investments won't be made in that technology, in the rollout that's required, until we can factor in a carbon price for the charcoal, not just the trees, the piddly $1 or $2 you pay to offset with the trees. We actually need to be paying $20 a tonne or $30 a tonne to make sure that the charcoal option's effective.